Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 5, where we're going to talk about engaging families in the transition process. I think we'll talk, generally about some strategies and ways and the importance of engaging families, but I think we're going to do it definitely through the lens of transition, and I'm really excited to share with you lots of new strategies, I think, and also events and resources that we have built in the state, recognizing that we have to bring families, along with us in this transition process. So let's go ahead and get started with our slides this week. So just to be clear, our learning intentions really are, let's talk about why family engagement is so important. This is it's not always easy. I think it takes a lot of extra effort, right? We're already so busy, I think, in our days with just teaching our students and handling the paperwork and all the things that come with teaching, that sometimes, this extra effort around engaging families can feel, like maybe a burden or just feels like a lot more on your plate, right? But let's talk about the reasons why it's so important. And then we'll just kind of go through, what does the law say about parent participation, especially when it comes to the IEP process and IDEA, because there are definitely some specifics around that are unique to, parents who have a child that has an IEP. So hopefully you can hear me. My computer's telling me that my voice is poor. So I'm going to try to get closer to my laptop and see if that helps. So after we talk about the laws, we'll talk about strategies, like how do I engage my family? Sometimes we work with families that it's not easy to engage with. So we'll, I think, talk about some strategies on how to do that. And then, last but definitely not least, I'm going to spend some time showing you some great resources that we have here in our state that you may not know about. All right, let's get started. So why is family engagement so important? So there's been a lot of, research, I think, just for general ed students, but also for specifically for students with disabilities. But again, we see that the more a family is engaged, that we see higher student achievement, right? We know they have a lot to do with supporting their students. So we'll see increases in achievement, attendance, and behavior. So this one's huge. And, those of you that have been working in the schools for a while, you may have seen this, but people are talking about it, and the state data is showing this, and the national data is showing this, that since COVID, we have an attendance issue, right? So we see a lot more absenteeism, and that's something we're working on in the state too, for a number of different reasons. But if families are more engaged and we include them, and in the importance of students showing up at school, then I think we're going to see improved attendance, and of course, behavior along with that too. Improved social emotional skills when we engage and we're on the same page, I think, as families. And then graduation rates. I mean, our graduation rates in Utah are pretty high, but for our students, it's about 88% generally for for all students. But when we look at students with disabilities specifically, our graduation rate lags behind. It's about 65%. So we definitely can make improvements there. And then specific to students with disabilities, the research, like we talked about when we talked about the predictors in the first week of class, when we were kind of going over the basics of transition, we saw parent expectation as part of the predictors for post-school success. So we know when there's higher expectation from parents, that we see better post-school outcomes, right? So that means, we see students that are with disabilities that are higher rates of employment and higher rates of post-secondary education and training and independent living. So all the way around, family engagement has been shown to be important. Let's talk about what IDEA specifically says in terms of what, parents' rights are, and that we are obligated to make sure that parents have a voice, but parents must be full and equal participants in the IEP process. And hopefully you've had that experience. I think those of you, that have been at IEP meetings, hopefully you've seen some positive examples of this. I think sometimes we don't prepare parents very well for IEP meetings. So it can be intimidating. You know, they walk in with a room of professionals, and a lot of times we are using acronyms, and those can be alienating, or we're talking scores that make no sense to them, or programs that we use. So, yes, the law says they have to be full and equal participants, but I think we have to be super mindful of how we support parents to actually be full and equal participants, because I think sometimes they don't feel that way. So something to be mindful of, things like having an acronym list or just not using acronyms. That's a great place to start. Having the parent kind of go first, right, and listen to their concerns. And I think listening is huge. Like real active listening, mirroring their concerns. So mirroring back what they said to you, but in a different way, so that they know that you heard them. There's lots of different, I think, strategies we can apply there to make families feel comfortable. And of course, if there's language barriers, making sure that we have interpreters available, that we don't necessarily like use students as interpreters. That's not ideal. But parents also have the right to provide information and be involved in the evaluation process. So what that means is if the parent has any kind of outside testing, for example, that was done, or just any other kind of medical information, they can bring that information, and the school must consider that for like an initial evaluation or even for a reevaluation. So, we want to make sure that we are welcoming that input and that information from parents. The school isn't always necessarily obligated to use their information for eligibility purposes. So in other words, just because they bring an assessment that says their student, has XY disability, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the end all be all in determining what category the student falls under an IDEA, but it does have to be taken into consideration, right? So the parent has that right. They also have the right to be part of the group that makes educational placement decisions. So there's that evaluation process where we determine whether a student has a disability, if there's a need for special education. And then there's the placement decision, right, of where the student's going to be placed, whether that be in in an entirely inclusive setting, or a special class, or a special school, or what that's going to look like. So they should have a voice in that. Schools should not just decide, oh, just because a student has this type of eligibility, category or label on them, that means they belong in this certain classroom. So parents can be part of that conversation, and we need to, I think, have those conversations openly, right? Like, where is the student going to receive the service? That's placement. Okay, opportunities to participate in meetings regarding identification, evaluations. We kind of talked about those two things: identifying the student, using evaluations to identify them as a student with a disability that needs special education. Placement, we just talked about, and then the provisions of FAPE, free and appropriate public education for their child. So those provisions mean, what are the services, the service times, the related services, transportation, all those things that a student may need to get a free and appropriate public education. So that's really like all of the processes that a student goes through under IDEA. The students or the family needs a voice, the parents need a voice. So, and then it's important, and those of you that are teaching older students, that the student or that the family, especially the parent, is informed of the transfer of rights. So what that means is, when a student turns 18, which oftentimes students turn 18 during their high school year, their senior year, all of a sudden, all those IDEA parent rights, they transfer to that adult student. And sometimes that's really scary, and sometimes that's really shocking, because the parent all of a sudden, feels like, oh, wow, like I don't get all these rights. Now my adult student gets these rights. So there has to be an explanation of that transfer of rights and that process. And there's actually paperwork that is signed, and that has to be done no later than the student's 17th birthday. So usually that's done, the year before, so typically in 11th grade. But some school districts decide to do that at age 16. They say, we're going to do parent rights 2 years before, so the parent really understands it. In some cases, it might be warranted that the parent gets guardianship if the student has really complex needs and they can't make decisions for themselves. But in most cases, we want, to preserve, I think, an adult students with disabilities ability to kind of make their own choices with supports. So we don't want to like exclude the parents, right? Necessarily when they turn 18. But really, I think, know that now they are kind of responsible for themselves. In the eyes of the law, they are an adult at 18 and over, unless the parent goes through the legal process of getting guardianship. So that's essentially what the law says, but let's talk, again, law is always like the basic compliance part, right? But we always want to talk about what's an effective practice. So family engagement really is kind of a combination, I think, of these three things. So what are we talking about when we say family engagement? We used to say family involvement, but the language kind of changed around that, because just because a parent can't come to the school and be involved in PTA or volunteer at field trips, those kinds of things, doesn't mean they aren't engaged, right? It doesn't. Engagement happens different ways and looks different. So how can we, I think, foster that? It's not this an expectation that it all comes from the parent side. The expectation is that we apply these strategies and create a welcoming environment and figure out the best way to engage families, because our families are also different. So we start with this idea of really getting to know them, because there's no two families that are alike. The family makeup, the family values, the cultures, the language, all those things, expectations. So really getting to know them as people and what's important to them is a huge part of family engagement. And then this idea of building positive relationships. Like when I look back to all the years I taught all of my students, it was all about like, if I could build a positive relationship with the family and have this sense of trust, I don't think we automatically earn their trust. I think we have to work to kind of gain that trust. And, there's several different ways we can do that, but certainly, I think just trying to build a relationship, right? Being open and honest and responsive and interested, genuinely interested, and then figuring out ways to meaningfully involve them. Like I mentioned, a lot of our traditional ways were, come to the class and volunteer. Well, a lot of families can't do that, or they may not even come to parent teacher conference for whatever reason, but it could be, all these other restraints they have going on. So thinking of kind of different ways that we can meaningfully involve the families all kind of lead to this idea of family engagement. So how do we develop effective family engagement? Well, like, starting with getting to know them, like even just the composition. I was always amazed that like, sometimes I would find out that a parent was actually a grandparent. This happened to me a lot, where I just made the assumption that the person that brought my student to school was their mom. Then I would find out later that it's their grandmother or their aunt or their older sister, or right, like families look different. They might be spending part of the time with mom, part of the time with dad, with grand. I mean, it just, kind of just learning what that looks like, I think, for each one of your students, and knowing what some of their challenges are, maybe what some of their experiences are. I mean, I had some parents that I felt like had a bit of a chip on their shoulder and didn't really want to engage with me, and I found out later that like they didn't have a great experience in school, right? And so that obviously is going to kind of affect how they related with me to start off. So I knew that parent, I needed to work a little bit harder to gain their trust and develop a relationship, and hopefully they would be open to having a relationship with me too. So that's super important. Building those positive relationships, trust and mutual respect. I think sometimes you have parents that immediately kind of respect you because you are an educator and you're a professional, but that's not necessarily the case. And I think there has to be that back and forth mutual respect and trust. Otherwise you can't have that positive relationship. And if you can establish that, it goes such a long way, right? If we feel like we have a good trusted mutual relationship with our parents and of our students. Meaningfully involving families. So trying to actively create opportunities for parents to collaborate with educators. So we, a lot of that is sending positive notes home. I think a lot of times our parents of students with disabilities, they hear a lot of the negative stuff, what their student can't do, issues they've had at school. But I think anytime we can share positive messages about their student, that's huge when it comes to those building those relationships. And I think then they're more willing to share things that, bright spots that have happened at home. And so I think whenever you can do that, think of different ways to, invite them into your classroom if they can't come to field trips, for example, or they can't come to activities, parties that are happening in the school. What are other ways you can engage them? Maybe they have a kind of a unique interest or skill that they could share with, your class or with students. So I think just kind of thinking outside of the box around that. And then building on the strengths of the family and the students. So we talk a lot about this idea of strengths-based IEPs, and we've talked a ton about SPIN. So, building on the students' strengths. I think we can do that with families too. So instead of looking at a family that, speaks a different primary language at home as a negative or as a barrier, think of that as a strength. Like, how cool is that to have come from another country and have to kind of learn a new language and navigate? Like, that takes a lot of grit and perseverance. And, those are some strengths. So I think we can learn about the family's strengths and how they support their students and use those to engage families. I want to definitely talk a little bit about parent emotions. My first 2 years of teaching, I taught kindergarten through second grade students with really complex needs. Most of them had autism, although back in the mid 90s, a lot of doctors were really reluctant to give the autism diagnosis. So I had a lot of students that were definitely autistic, but they weren't given that label. There weren't great tools out there. Diagnoses for autism happened later than it does now because we just know more now and there are better tools out there. So I had a lot of parents that were grieving, like just kind of coming to terms with the fact that they knew that their student was not developing normally. It was pretty hard and pretty stressful. And I had students that were had a lot of trouble communicating. So they had a lot of, problematic behaviors, and that was difficult. I had families, I think in my first year teaching, I had several families that their marriages didn't last, and I had several families who couldn't keep their kids at home and actually had them in a group home because they were either harming their other children, or they were, like, in some cases punching the walls and destroying their homes, and parents weren't getting any, like, it was just, they were in crisis mode all the time. And at the same time, I think grieving the loss of feeling like they had a normal child. So I think especially if you're working in those younger grades, think about that. Parents are still kind of going through that process of wrapping their head around all the worries they have about their child with a disability and what that means for them in their life. So definitely think about that. I've also had experiences where sometimes the parents have very, very low expectations for their, child, especially if they're like pretty involved physically and medically, they are super concerned, but then they just don't want to have any expectation. And so, trying to work with them to kind of, I think, build some trust. And then I think you can stretch that a little bit and show the parent what the student can do and kind of keep moving forward and have those expectations kind of raised step by step. But then I've also had the experience of families that had like super high expectations for a student that might have been somewhat unrealistic. And again, I think that's part of that, like, grieving a little bit and sort of letting go of that dream of, they still want their child to go to traditional college. Or, like, I had an example of a student whose mom wanted her to be a nurse, but the student had, some real challenges around communication, physical communication, barriers. And so again, she had super high expectations, and I had to develop, a trust with her to kind of meet in the middle. So, I think kind of knowing where the parents are and what they're going through, and being patient with that and listening, instead of making it like a win-lose situation, but really kind of listening and seeing how you can kind of come somewhere, meeting in the middle, right, type of a thing. And then, they have a lot on their plates. Like, sometimes I had families that had multiple children with disabilities, and they weren't sleeping at all, and they were running to doctor's appointments, and then they had other kids. They act as the case manager, they act as the nurse at home, they have to advocate and sometimes fight for services. They have to think about their futures. So, parents of students with disabilities have a lot going on. So I think anytime we can just be really aware of that and, work with that, and I think kind of allow some space, right, for knowing what they're going through. All right. Parent stressors and can be a lot. There's not a ton of support out there for families. And I think especially families of students with disabilities. I mean, if like I talked briefly last week about that waiting list, that DSPD, and that's a reality sometimes where a family could really use some respite care, someone to come in their home and spend some time with their child with significant needs so that they have a bit of a break. But that's not always the case. And many times they're waiting or never get that kind of relief. So, and of course there's financial, struggles too. A lot of times insurance doesn't cover a lot of things. So they're having to cover a lot themselves. Of course, healthcare concerns. I've had parents that, didn't have cars, so lack of transportation, language barrier, and then also difficulty with stable housing. That can be a concern too. So I think just being aware of all these things. And then, of course, if you know services that can help some of these situations that parents might find themselves in, then, that's great too. Some schools do a great job of, they have food banks and they have support for families around the holidays and all of those kinds of things too. But I think just being aware first and foremost. All right, so how can we kind of help support our families? Again, creating that welcoming environment. Being open to having your families, drop in if that works out okay. I know, I think when I first taught, I was a little bit intimidated with having families kind of just like show up in my classroom, or if we were out doing a community kind of a event or something, I didn't always reach out to see if they wanted to be part of that. And I think I learned to be more comfortable with that, and then realize, wow, those are some great moments to build trust, to get to know them better when you do invite them in. And there were definitely times where things were a little bit uncomfortable, but I think that's where you grow the most if you put yourself out there and you are somewhat uncomfortable, but there's so much to be gained from that. So always thinking about how we can kind of welcome parents, whether it be in the classroom or out in the community or at different events, welcome their input, things like that. And then accommodating their schedule. So this one's big. So I had the experience where I could not get the parent to come to the IEP meeting, and I had tried 3 different times to schedule an IEP meeting, for example, and they just wouldn't come. So I've had IEPs in families' homes. I had a single mom when I taught in Heber, and she was struggling, and she's like, she worked at like a gas station. She goes, my break is, from 5 to 5:30. I showed up at the gas station and we did the IEP at like sitting in a booth at the gas station during her break. So, just really kind of being flexible and mindful and accommodating, I think can go, an awfully long way. So those are just some examples. Listen and respond to concerns. I think I got better with practice, just being more of an open listener. I think we are uncomfortable with silence. So you're sitting in a meeting and there's silence and you want to fill it with just talking the whole time. But I think when we really listen and then use that kind of reflective listening, so things like, I think I heard you say this, right? Or tell me more about that. What does this look like at home? How would you like? So just having, really active listening and making sure that we heard them correctly. And also, I think allowing some space for kind of their fear. So sometimes we'll say, oh, the parents being really rigid, or they don't understand this, but sometimes it's our lack of understanding, or we don't give them the opportunity to, talk about their past experiences or their fears. And I think by being an active listener, they feel more heard, right? Which then makes them feel more like they'll trust you more. And then there's just a better relationship to begin with. So, and then helping them navigate the education and outside agency system. So especially if they're new to the whole IEP process, that can be really daunting. So sharing, the IEP draft with them, like preparing them for the meeting, making sure that their concerns, I would always ask my parents, like they go first in the IEP meeting, what's at the forefront of your mind right now? Like where do you want to start? So kind of helping them to best navigate what that IEP process is like, or just what the new building is like. So if a student is, a lot of times parents have a ton of fears when their students go from like elementary to middle to high school, super scary. A lot of times parents want to keep their kids in elementary school, right? We don't do that. We want to move students along with their non-disabled peers, but parents sometimes have some real fears about that. So, invite them to tour the middle school with their student, help kind of ease, I think, some of those concerns. And then, of course, the outside agency system. So that's, huge. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about collaborating and outside agencies. But again, if you can be the link to what some of those services are outside of school, that just helps the families out a ton, because it is difficult to navigate that. They don't have an assigned case manager. For example, sometimes you're that person. So the more that you know, and the more that you can kind of help explain things, and that comes with experience, I get it. But I think when I was new to transition, I just would go to transition fairs, and I would, meet with community partners, and I would comb websites. I would just try to get as much information and understanding of how these outside agencies worked so that I could really connect and encourage families, to pursue those services. Because oftentimes it's a scary process. And then assist in finding support networks. So also I would try to kind of pair families together or parents together as like a support. Like I knew that I had a parent of a student that maybe aged out, and they had been through, the DSPD process, and they had been through VR, and they had been through applying for Social Security income. And like, so I would kind of match them together. Well, of course I would ask the parents, do you mind if I connect you with this parent that's kind of struggling and doesn't know how to navigate a certain type of whatever system, let's say. So that was great. And then I would also sometimes do these parent information nights where I would get a panel of parents, of current parents of my students, and then also former, so students that had aged out of my program. I would ask them back, and then I would just open it up to parents in the district, and then I would kind of facilitate the panel and ask questions. And it was really amazing how, parents will listen to you to a certain extent, but when they can learn things from other parents who have been through it, it's phenomenal. So I think anytime you can use parents to help other parents and kind of connect them, make those connections, is a great thing. It's a great way to support families. So I already kind of talked a little bit about this, but accommodating families, like I can't tell you how many IEPs I've had in homes. I had a number of students whose grandparents were raising them, and they were so overwhelmed. I can't even imagine being like in your later years and then having a grandchild to raise. Not only that, but a child with a disability. I would recommend, when you if you do go to homes to have IEP meetings, it's great to bring another person with you. I didn't always do this, but I think it's better if you can, for a number of reasons, right? So if anything happens, it's like you've got someone else there from your school district to sort of vouch for how things went, and you just have that, additional support. So for example, I've done some meetings where I would bring a paraeducator, or I would bring a school counselor with me. Like I mentioned, I've had IEPs at parents' workplace. There's sometimes where you have to have them over the phone. I mean, this was before the days of Zoom. Now, we've at least got that. But back then it was, IEPs over the phone sometimes. I mentioned the parent-to-parent mentors, the information panels. I've even, I had a situation with a student whose mom also had a significant disability. So she really couldn't support her own child. And so the grandparent was the main support for this student that I had. But this woman, this older woman, the grandmother, she had macular degeneration, which means she was losing her sight. Like she couldn't even drive or write a check or read the paperwork. And I would go to her all the time. I'd go to her house. I would sometimes pick her up and the student, and we would go, to the doctor together. So I'm not to say that you have to do all these things, but like, I was teaching students 18 to 22, and there were just times where we needed to get my students some medical and mental health services. And the only way to do it was for me to go pick up grandma and the student, and go to the appointment together. So these are just examples of things that sometimes, are necessary. And then meeting at the VR office. So what I mean by that is, to try to make things a little bit easier. So if the parent doesn't have time in their schedule to come to the school for an IEP and the VR office for an appointment, try to do those together. So I would sometimes invite the VR counselor to my IEP meetings, and I'd say, treat this as an intake. Like we're going to kill two birds with one stone. Or I would, meet the parent at the VR office, and if there was paperwork they had to sign, or we did the IEP there. So just trying to be flexible about those things, I think is a great example of how we can accommodate families. All right, so let's talk a little bit about parent resources that are out there. So hopefully you all know about the Utah Parent Center, but I cannot tell you how lucky we are in Utah to have the most amazing parent center. Every state has to have a parent and information training center. We just happen to have a unbelievably fabulous one. And they put together a couple of years ago a series of workshops called Transition University. And I was involved in helping them kind of plan that and, making sure all the messages and the information in their workshops were accurate. And they did an incredible job, but they do these throughout the state. They're mostly online. I think some might be in person, and they also do them in Spanish. But these are the topics. So they cover citizenship and advocacy. So talking about helping youth and families understand self-advocacy, how important it is. Disability rights. So I think a lot of people don't understand our history when people with disabilities, had no rights, and how we used to treat them and institutionalize them. So they kind of go through this unit of how important it is, and that without advocacy, our individual with disabilities would not really kind of have the options they have today, because our history was really not great when it came to how we served and treated individuals with disabilities. So they kind of do this whole unit on that. Also the importance of having a voice and voting. So I do want to mention that these workshops are designed for families, certainly, but they are supposed to include youth. So our transition age youth, 14 to 22 and beyond, they can attend these workshops with their parents or with their family members. So it's kind of in conjunction with, they're really aimed at both the youth and the families. Then they do one on daily life, which is really understanding the importance of transition IEP. Yay, they go through the whole process. They talk about how important transition is, the options for graduation, what post-high looks like, what kinds of post-secondary options, college programs, employment supports, daily life skills. So they do a whole unit on that. They also have one on community living, a lot of emphasis on self-determination, person-centered planning. There's something called Charting the Life course, which is some tools that you can use around this idea of person-centered planning. So it's not just about, oh, this individual has XYZ disability, they need to go to this workshop or something, right? It's not like, it's all about what does the family want, what does the individual want, and then how do we build those supports needed so the student can have like this great meaningful life. So it's really nice. And then they talk about housing options, right? Just because a person has a disability doesn't mean that they want to stay with their family forever. They might want to live in an apartment or a group home or whatever that might look like. So they talk a lot about that. Then there's safety and security, helping families navigate that idea of, guardianship. Is that necessary, or do they just need to learn more about supported decision making, where the individual, young person who's 18 or older keeps their own ability to make decisions, but they do it in a kind of a structured way with support. So their rights aren't taken away from them necessarily through legal guardianship, but there's a planned way that the family can feel okay with their son or daughter, who's now 18 or older, making decisions, but in a very kind of supported way. So that's what supported decision making is. They talk a little bit about, other different legal things around estate planning, power of attorney, conservatorship, ABLE accounts, and we can get into a little bit more about this, but that's a way that people that are receiving Social Security can still save money and invest money in ABLE accounts, and how to navigate SSI, because that's kind of a big one too, that supplemental security income. Then they do one unit on social things where they kind of, talk a lot about, how do we make friends? A lot of times once students with disabilities leave school, they don't have access to their friends anymore, right? And so how do we develop new friendships? How do we maintain friendships? They even talk about dating and other social opportunities. We don't want people isolated at home, so they really focus on that. And then the last one is about healthy living, navigating transition from the pediatric healthcare to adult healthcare. I talked about this a little bit in our intro, how that can be a big deal, like a family is used to their pediatrician for years, and now all of a sudden they have to transfer their adult child with a disability to the adult healthcare process, which is not easy. And then they talk a lot about mental health resources and Medicaid as well. So they basically cover just about everything you could possibly imagine for transition. So I highly recommend, again, I'm going to go back. These are called Transition University. That link takes you straight to the Utah Parent Center website. And there's also these really cool workbooks that they've developed that go along with these workshops, but you can also just take the workbook and, share them out with students and families, but there's some really great things in there. Other things that the Parent Center does, in most of our large and medium districts throughout the whole state, and then there's also a person for charter schools. But I want to say, gosh, there's probably like 15 of our school districts have embedded Utah Parent Center consultants. So you might know who yours is. And they're great. They work in conjunction with the school district. They help parents. They run workshops sometimes. They'll attend IEPs. So if you don't know who that person is and you work in a medium or large district, chances are you have one. Find out who they are. They probably have their own schedule of workshops. I taught in Murray District, and whenever we had any kind of a parent center workshop, I went. I would tell my parents about it and say, please come. Sometimes I would try to have an incentive if the parents would bring their student, but I would show up too. And I think that also creates that trust, like the parents seeing you and they're like, wow, you're here in the evening. And it's like, well, yeah, this is important, not only for them to attend, but I felt like it was important for me to learn, what was out there for families. And again, to kind of feel like I was there visually and as a support to the parents. So you can't go wrong. All of the stuff out of the Parent Center is amazing. Family Links Conference. Yeah, I think every year, or at least every other year, they put together a conference called Family Links. And I forgot the S on the word link, but that's on their website too. So you could find out when that's happening. And then if a parent is struggling through the IEP process and they just can't see eye to eye with the IEP team, the first option we always suggest is that they get a parent advocate to attend the meeting with them. And those parent advocates from the Utah Parent Center are incredible. They are parents themselves of individuals, child with a disability. So they've got the parent experience, but they know the whole IEP process really well. And so they are really great. And I think it's a wonderful support for families. And then they have ongoing events calendar. So I linked right here where it says events for families and youth. So that link directly takes you to the Utah Parent Center event calendar. And there's stuff going on all the time. So check that out. I would also share with parents anytime I got an email from Utah Parent Center. So get on their newsletter and you'll get emails, and I would just forward those all to parents. So another great thing you can do. Okay. And then another great thing we've got available for parents, we just launched, this has been like a 3-year project that I've done with my colleagues, is we felt like the state needed a one-stop shop for all things transition, because it's so difficult to figure out like all these different services and agencies we have, and how does a person navigate all this stuff. So we felt the need to put it all together in one website. Took us 3 years to build it. We finally launched at the end of August. There is kind of this explanation. There's a couple videos on there of the transition process and what we see as best practices around transition. There's links to every single state agency, community partners, and really the main audience for this website was, we have an area on the website specifically for youth and families with tons of resources. I'm going to go there in a minute and show you. And then we have a whole section for educators. So if you're new to transition and you need a refresh, you click on the educator section and all this stuff pops up about, what is transition? What does it mean? How do we do this the right way? And then again, tons of resources and links. And then we have a section on the website for community partners. So what we want is for all of our community partners to kind of come to this website and go, oh, like, well, how do I fit into transition? How can I help support the schools and the teams and, students and families? And so the idea is that we are teaching the community partners a little bit about what transition means in terms of like IDEA law, what the process should look like, how they can fit into the process, how, they should collaborate. So that's how the website's set up. I'm going to go there in a minute and just give you a quick little demo. But before I do that, I want to announce one more thing. So every single year, you may or may not be familiar with our Utah's post-secondary Institute. Here it is. Utah's Institute on Post-Secondary Transition. So every year we put together a 2-day conference in Provo. And, we have, over 300 people usually come to this conference. And the first day is for anyone in the state that's interested in transition, wants to learn more. The second day is dedicated to teams that are coming from schools or districts. So you have to come with a team of 2 or more. And there's planning time. So the idea is that you take all this great stuff that you learned about transition, and a school or a district team will put together a plan with some goals. And that's what happens on the second day. The exciting thing that we're doing this year is we've never really reached out specifically to families and students themselves, to youth themselves. And we realize, what, it's time, right? Like, we can provide educators and outside community partners as much information on transition as absolutely possible, but without including families and students in this process, we maybe won't get so far. So this year, we are going to have specific strands of breakout sessions that are just for families, and we have ones that are really for youth. So it's going to be a lot around, teaching youth how to be self-determined, self-advocates, kind of have a voice in this whole process. So we're super excited. If you are not already part of a school district team, it doesn't matter if you're elementary. We have elementary folks on teams, middle school, like anyone, school counselors, parents. Please share this information, and I will link the flyer itself. This is just a screenshot, but I'll link the flyer for this institute. It doesn't have live registration yet. As it says on the flyer, it'll come out in February, but we're super excited. So I would hope and love it if you spread the word on this, and that you would come to the Transition Institute. It's in Provo on June 10th and 11th. And educators can earn a stipend, because in most cases you'll be off contract because it's summertime, but you can earn a stipend to come to the Institute. So in other words, you can get paid. All right, so I'm going to share the website right now and just do a quick walkthrough. All right, here is our, okay, there we go. This is our Transition Elevated website. And I'm not going to take the time to play the video, but you can certainly go through it. This is the home page. So it really kind of talks about, all right, well, what is our vision of post-secondary transition? Who are our audience, educators, community partners, students, and families? What is the purpose? So that's kind of what the home page is. I'm going to try not to make you dizzy. This what is post-secondary transition is kind of a nice place to start. I don't know, my computer's being slow, but this definition of what does it even mean? What are we talking about when we're talking about post-secondary transition? So here's a kind of a description of what that is. There's another nice little video that sort of talks about transition, and there's the flow chart you guys all know so well by now, right? There's some frequently asked questions about transition. That's a great place for parents to go, or anyone that's new. And then there are all those components that we just talked about in the IEP. So assessments, post-secondary goals, services, and then each one of these links to a Padlet that goes even deeper into all of those sections and components and coordination with outside agencies. So these are those 7 components that we just spent, last week really diving into. So I'm just going to quickly show you the educators page. So if you're an educator and you're kind of new and you want to find out, hey, how can I learn more about transition? There's Canvas courses that we have from State Board of Education. There's other learning opportunities, all these Padlets that you guys have already seen, some of our Padlets. And then there is this kind of menu of all the things that are really important within transition planning. So we want to be student focused. We want to help develop student skills. Interagency collaboration is huge. Family engagement is huge, and program structures. So each one of these, if you click, it tells you what this is and what it means. And then if you scroll to the bottom, there are all these resources related to that area of transition. So there's tons here. We tried to bring it all together. So that's the educators page. I'm going to go, since we're talking about families today, I'm going to go to students and families. And there are lots of resources here. There's some kind of quotes from Transition University, the Parent Center workshops I just talked about why family engagement is so important. Lots of quotes from Utah families are on here. There's a few links here on how to prepare students for success in college, a self-determination and self-advocacy Padlet, understanding the process. So we talk a little bit about the loss, so the families understand the process and how it's part of IDEA. And then at the bottom, again, these are all the supports. So if a family wants information on employment, they would go here. And there's tons of links just specific to like what's out there to support their student around employment. Let's say the parent is interested in post-secondary education and wants more information. There's a whole bunch of links for that. Let's say it's healthcare they're needing some links for. So that's what these little topics are. Independent living, how do they get supports for their student for independent living? Again, a whole bunch of resources and links. So that's how they are organized on the parent page. And then just quickly down here, we always want to celebrate success stories. So we've got some videos from examples in our state, from college examples, employment examples. This is Utah School for the Deaf and Blind rowing team. So just some fun little videos of success stories. So that's a great place to start. Sometimes parents really need to see like what's possible, especially when, they have a lot of struggles, right, with their supporting their child with a disability. So I'm not going to go to the community partners one right now because I don't want to take up more time. However, that is, that's kind of it for our section on family engagement. And there is an assignment to do a family or like a family parent interview, but I'm going to do a separate video for that assignment. And again, that's not due until finals week, but we will start talking about it, and I'll do a separate video for that so that everybody, feels like they understand what is expected for that assignment. And otherwise, I will see you all next week, and I hope you all have a great week. Thanks.